Welcome everybody to the 20th edition of the Berlin Literature Festival. Due to the pandemic, many of the festival's events will only take place online. My name is Stefan Weidner and I'm a German writer, literary critic and translator from the Arabic. I'm going to talk today to Dr. Alaa Al-Aswani from Egypt, one of the most famous and most widely read writers of our time, and he's a good friend of mine too. He's a novelist, but he also writes political commentary, at present for the Deutsche Welle, at other times for the New York Times, and of course for Egyptian newspapers when the political circumstances still allowed that. Nearly all of his books are translated, so you don't need to speak Arabic to discover him as a writer. He's best known for his novel The Jacobian Building, but also for his other books like Chicago, The Automobile Club of Egypt, or his essay The Dictatorship Syndrome. His most recent novel, Jumhuriyat Ke'enne, the title of which we could translate as maybe Wannabe Republic, or more literally, The Republic as If, which I have here with me in Arabic. I can show it to you. This is the most recent novel by Alaa Al-Aswani in Arabic, Jumhuriyat Ke'enne, The Wannabe Republic. We will talk about this too. And it's about to be translated in several languages. I think there's already a translation into French. Its title is J'ai couru vers le Nil. So they have changed the title a bit. It will be translated into German, and I think there's also a English translation in preparation. Maybe it's also noteworthy that apart from being a novelist, Dr. Alaa Al-Aswani is also a dentist. We can even say he's the most famous dentist of Egypt, and certainly of world literature. Alaa is joining me from New York, where he is in Brooklyn, and well, kind of lives in exile. Hello, marhaban.
أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا وسهلا.
And I'm very happy to see you, my dear friend. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm happy to see you. I'm happy to see you. Can I still say Sabah al-Khair? Is it still the morning?
Yeah. It's 11 a.m. in New York.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I have just said that, I don't know if it's correct. I've just said that you live in exile in the US. Is it true, and how comes?
Well, as you know, exile is very vague term because I mean, nobody really decided to kick me out of Egypt, but it is exile in the sense that when your life becomes impossible and you're banned from everything, and you feel that you and your family members are in danger, and then you decide to go out of your country, you could use exile. So there was no an official decision, the 19th century model to exile the writer. Yes, it didn't happen, but my life in Egypt has become impossible in a way.
That's sad to hear. But you just mentioned the great movement of exiled Arab writers who came to New York from Lebanon and Syria and several other countries, and they founded a journal. And so there is a certain presence of, yes, Arab intellectual life in Egypt. In New York. Do you still feel connected to this, to those former people who came to New York, and does it still continue to exist, this intellectual life in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. I must say that I studied here in America 30 years ago, and I had a master's degree in the University of Illinois in Chicago, and I wrote a novel about my experience in Chicago.
Exactly.
So I could claim that I know the US to some extent, and New York is very, very, very cultural, you know. So yes, this is true. That before the pandemic, I used to really enjoy the cultural life in New York, and I met many important writers, and of course I could think about Victor Hugo, for example, and I could think about Thomas Mann, which is very interesting experience. And I wrote about Thomas Mann in my book, The Dictatorship Syndrome. Yes, of course, it is. I could feel the culture here, and it's a really a cosmopolitan place. So, for example, one out of three New Yorkers was born out of the U.S.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Oh yes.
So you don't feel really, you don't feel that you are a kind of intruder, or kind of you don't feel racism in the bad way, because
Yes.
there are racist people, but it's impossible to practice racism in New York.
That's a very good message. That's a very good
Yes,
message. Yes,
yes,
if everybody is a stranger there, nobody's a stranger, you know, because
exactly.
yes, yes, this is a wonderful, wonderful metaphor. So I think you teach at some universities. You give writing classes, creative writing classes. Is that right?
Yeah, I taught at creative writing at Bard College, at Dartmouth University, and I'm going to teach in the coming spring at Princeton University.
Wow.
And I teach creative writing and reading fiction.
Wow. Oh yes.
I try to help the people to appreciate literature. I have my collection of masterpieces and good literature, sometimes written by writers who are not known, you know.
Oh yes.
But I help my students to appreciate literature, and I help them to improve their writing if they are interested in creative writing. And I have in New York my own workshop for creative writing. So
Oh yes.
students, yes. So yes. So I have I have many things to do, as a matter of fact.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So you help writers to start if they want, or when they want to begin, or to become a writer. So how were your own beginnings as a writer? Did you have somebody who coached you or who helped you to get along? How did you become a writer? How was this decision born for you?
It was my only dream when I was kid. I was an only child, and my father was a famous writer in Egypt, and he was a lawyer. And you know, I was very much attached to my father, so it was my only dream to be a writer. And
Okay.
he did coach me. He told me very early, the first one to tell me that I have a talent in writing. And then he told me what to read and how to do. And he passed away when I was 19. So I had the essential roadmap for writing. He's the one who convinced me to have another profession, to be an
Okay.
independent writer, because he said fiction writer in Egypt, fiction writing doesn't make any money. So you should have another profession. Otherwise, you will be under pressure by the dictatorship. And it was a very good advice, you know. And I was never paid by the Egyptian government, never, no one single Egyptian pound. You know why? Because I have been independent. Because I was paid. I always have been paid either by my patients or by my readers.
Yeah, I can imagine that this is very important in a situation like in Egypt. Also, given the fact that maybe most readers or the audience in Germany or in Europe doesn't know this, but many of the Arab publishing houses, especially in Egypt and especially in like the 70s, 80s, they were owned by the state, wasn't it? And
Yes,
yes, so the state could really, there was not a strict censorship as far as I know, but they could of course influence what will be published or not, wasn't it?
absolutely. And I add to that that even if you, for the private publishing houses, it is under control of the security. And for
Oh yes.
example, my publishing house, the editor told me, for example, about this latest novel. He told me, listen, this probably the best novel you wrote, but we cannot publish simply because we will be sent to prison. And I told him, okay, I'm prepared for prison, you know. And he said, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared, you know. So it's like this. And of course, they put pressure on you. For example, I was paid by, I used to write a weekly article in the biggest private newspaper in Masri, and I was paid a very good salary. And all of a sudden, you get banned. So if you don't have another profession to make your living, you'll be in a real trouble. You know,
Yes.
I
Yes.
was fortunate. I was lucky because of my father's advice to be a dentist because they cannot close my clinic. You know.
Yes. Yeah, that's wonderful. So you became a dentist to become a writer, which is, well, yeah. I'm just wondering how your students in the US will react if you tell them this story.
I tell them, I usually tell them because, you know, I try to be their friend and we talk a lot about each other's, you know, problems, lives, and of course I tell them this that I was because they should, you know, the problem is that you could find a very talented student, but he's not determined to be a writer. You know,
Oh, yes.
he's not focusing on writing. And
Oh,
I
yes.
always tell them the story that my father told me, listen, you to be a writer, you are, he told me, you're a potential good writer. But to be a real writer, you should have writing as your first priority. So if you consider anything more important than writing in your life, you should stop writing because
Mm, yes.
you'll never be able to make it. You see,
Hmm.
and I tell
Hmm.
that to my students because I think it's
Hmm.
very useful.
That's a good anecdote. Yes, I think it's important for everybody, even in Germany. One of your last books is the dictatorship syndrome. You call it the dictatorship syndrome. How did you come to write such a book? It's a political essay. You know, it's like the tradition of Hannah Arendt and other great political writers. How did you come to write such a book?
Well, it was not an idea. It was not the idea was not mine in the beginning. I had an invitation by Barbara Chwesky, the my publisher, to make a long interview, you know, about dictatorship.
Oh yes.
Uh, the same way the Israeli writer Amos Oz made an interview about terrorism. You know, it's a way to expose your ideas as a writer, and the publisher is assuming that you have many readers, which is I'm lucky to have many readers. So we began in London some sessions of the interview, and we had the intention to publish this interview in a book. And then after the third or fourth session, I realized that we have reached a very important ideas. And I told Barbara that, listen, I don't feel comfortable with publishing this as an interview. I'm going to write on it, to work on it, and I'm going to work on it so that we could make a book. And she got very happy. So I went back to Egypt and I began the writing chapter after chapter. And of course, it was very useful to me because I had to make more and more research about the different dictators all over the world. You know,
Yes.
so it was my findings are unbelievable. You know, it's that they have almost everything in common. Sometimes you find sentences said by an African dictator, and then
Yes.
this sentence is the same sentence
Oh, yes.
Al Sisi or Nasser said
Wow.
in Egypt. The same
Wow.
sentence, you know, because
Uh,
the mechanism is the
yeah.
same.
Yes. Yes. So, but why do people obey? I mean, why does dictatorship? Of course, sometimes it gets dictators fall, especially if there's a intervention from the outside, like was the case with Hitler. But it's very rare that dictators just disappear by themselves. You know, so usually the people obey to them. You know, what is doing that? Is that the barrier of fear, or why do people continue to live under dictators without going out to protest?
Well, because the dictatorship is a mutual relation. It is not a one
Okay.
man. It is not a one-man phenomenon, you know,
Okay.
because the dictator is a single person. He cannot impose himself on millions of people unless those millions of people need a dictator, you know. So
Hmm.
it's always a mutual relation. The phenomena is mutual. And you will find, as I found, that usually people, when after a defeat in the war, or you know, a chaotic situation, or they need the dictator, they need a protector, they believe that they could give uh, the dictator the right to take away their political rights, and then in return he will protect them. And
Yes.
this what happened, very clear. It happens everywhere, but a very clear example in Italy. You know, Mussolini with the black shirts. You know, the people thought that the black shirts, the fascists, that are capable to restore order. You
Yes.
see, in Germany it was something like this by different, because the German people were defeated in the First World War, and they had a problem with their self-esteem, self-confidence, you know. So the fact that somebody, a strong man, would tell them, and you find this, and I wrote this in the book, the speeches of Hitler, you know, is
Yes.
that who tell them that we are Germans, we are important to the world, we should be proud of ourselves. It did work very well. So it's always there is a need of the dictator, and there is a dictator on the other side. And when it works together, the dictatorship happens.
Yes. 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 So, do you think, being in the US, do you think the US is on the brink of falling into the trap of such a dictatorship syndrome? Are you positive about the development, or are you afraid?
No, I'm very positive. I think that the US is a very good example that the dictatorship is mutual. Why? Because, of course, Mr. Trump has a very strong, you know, intention and motivation to be a dictator. I mean, he did act as a dictator from the very beginning, but the here, you know, you have institutions. How many decisions were taken by Mr. Trump, and then were stopped, were blocked by the judges, the
That's true.
colleges, the universities. Why? Because it's a real democracy. And
Yes.
I think Mr. Trump would have been much more comfortable if he was the president of one of the Arab countries.
Yes. 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 And you have a functioning federalism in the United States, you know?
Yes, it's
This,
not easy. It's
yeah.
not easy, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And he was very close to be impeached. And even if you follow the every day, he's making troubles all the time, you know. And he wants to monopolize power, and he wants to stay in power, and he's abusing his power too, because you know, he's trying to put people, his supporters, in very important positions, so that, and he's the first president in the history of the US who said, if I will lose these elections, it means that the elections are rigged
Yeah.
before the elections.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very strange. Yes.
That's crazy. But let's come back to Egypt and to literature. I mean, nonetheless, I mean, despite of all this dictatorship syndrome, the Egyptians stood up against Mubarak in 2011, as other Arabs did against their own dictators. So, kind of the barrier of fear was broken, or the mutual contract between dictator and people. And I think your books and articles, which appeared, many of them appeared before the revolution, your books and articles are quite representative for this breaking down of the barrier of fear, because and they contributed to the revolution. At least this is my reading, you know, because you don't show any restraint in criticizing the government, the president, and you were not afraid of censorship, you know. So, in your assessment, what was the role of literature for the Arab revolutions, and especially maybe for your own book? Maybe you can give an example concerning your own books.
Well, I don't think the literature should be used as a tool to change the situation. The literature, in my opinion, should not be used as a political tool. Literature doesn't change the situation. If you would like to change the situation, you should take to the street. You should make manifestations. You should make some political movement. But literature makes a change, which is much more important to me. Literature changes the people. Literature changes the vision of the world for the people. Accordingly, the people who will have a different conscious, a different vision of the world given to them by literature, those people will be much more capable to change the situation.
Yes.
You see? And I think this is something we should understand, because one of the problems of the Soviet Union is that they didn't understand this, and they pushed literature to be a political tool. Accordingly, the literature written under the Soviet Union, most of them, uh, it was just a propaganda, and it wasn't really a piece of art. So we should be. Garcia Marquez said, because he was criticized, he was leftist, and he was criticized by the leftist people in his country, in Colombia, because he was not very much to the line of the leftist commitment. And then he said a wonderful sentence. He said, if you would like to serve a cause, if you want to serve a cause, write a beautiful novel about the cause. And I found this wonderful.
Yes, I had the feeling that your books are a mirror of the Egyptian society before the revolution, and maybe in your most recent books after the revolution. It's an analysis of the Egyptian society, but it also, of course, contains a lot of very enticing, very attractive stories we want to follow, which capture us. We are falling in love with the protagonists, and we want to follow the destiny. So this kind of literature, of course, it does not directly influence the society, but it gives a mirror, and people see themselves in the mirror. And as you said, this is probably opening up a new perspective. But how comes, after all this opening up after the revolution, that then you had the counter-revolution? And now it seems to me, knowing Egypt from the time of Mubarak, which that was a dictatorship, but Mubarak was not, well, he was not completely brutal. There was always a middle way. You could publish things, you could say things. So it was a soft dictatorship, to my impression. I don't know what you say. But now it's a much harder dictatorship. And how did it come about? How did the revolution collapse? And now you have a situation which is maybe worse.
Yeah, but this is the history of revolutions. This is a typical, a typical path. Is that after the revolution, because when you make a revolution against the regime, what do you have as weapons? You revolutionary. You have your courage, your conscience, and your dream. I mean, all are moral weapons. On the other side, you have the regime, which is having everything. He has the army, the police, the money, the deep state, everything. So usually after the revolution, if you don't get rid totally from the regime, then the regime will act as a counter-revolution, and usually the counter-revolution in power after a revolution is much tougher, it's much more brutal than the initial regime. And I always say that Mubarak, or the regime in any revolution, if we consider the regime as a tiger the counter-revolution regime, which is ruling Egypt now, is a wounded tiger.
Oh, yes.
And the wounded tiger is much more dangerous than the tiger.
Oh,
Why?
yes.
Because the tiger usually has self-confidence, and it doesn't attack everybody. But when he gets wounded, he doesn't have this confidence he used to have. And he wants to make sure that this will never happen again. And this will never happen again as a sentence was said literally by Sisi more
Oh,
than
yes.
5 times in
Oh, wow.
different. He said 2011, the revolution will never happen again. Accordingly, to reconstruct, as you said, the barrier of fear which got broken during the revolution, he should be much more brutal than Mubarak.
Yes. Yes. Wow, that's a very difficult situation. Let's come back to literature. I think a special feature of your novels, especially, is your kind of writing, which I would describe as a very accessible writing. I would call it. Please contradict me or interrupt me if I'm not right, but I would call it realism. It's a realistic kind of a realistic literature. Like the great realist classics, let's say from Balzac or Tolstoy or Zola or Dickens, it's kind of a literature of this style. And this is a big difference to many other writers who, in Arab modernity, who try to copy or to make something like James Joyce did in Europe, or Marcel Proust, to write some avant-garde literature, which is fine, of course, but which is not very accessible to everybody. In comparison to those books, your literature is much more accessible. This is also true for me as a foreign reader. When I read your Arabic, it's much more fun to read this than to read, I don't know, Edward al-Kharat or many other very difficult writers, So how did you develop that language? That language which is at the same time very simple but also very deep. So you can get all the meanings you want, and you can tell all the stories, but you manage to have an accessible language. Did you work a lot on it? How did you develop your idea of literature?
Yes, of course, I did work, and I refused the school you just described. I refused to copy everything which happened in France. And I must say here, I'm a francophone, and I'm France is almost my second country. But I refuse to copy what the French writers are doing. I'm not really. I don't think this will make any good literature. This is my opinion. So I tried to write what I feel like writing, and of course I discovered that there is a kind of misconcept going around the literary circles, is that this misconcept relates what is simple to what is superficial, and what is complicated to what is profound. And I believe that this is totally wrong, because you could have a simple and profound text in the same time. And I'm not talking about myself anymore. I could give you many examples. Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Ernest Hemingway. If you read The Old Man and the Sea, for example, and then you could read this novel when you are 14 years old, you will understand something. When you read this novel when you are 60 years old, you will understand much more, because the first reading you were too young to understand everything. So the text I'm trying to achieve is a simple text, but stratified text, you see. And I believe in the life. I believe in the characters. I believe that I must be able to produce life on the papers, because many people write theoretical novels. There is no life. The characters and the plots and everything are theoretical. I must believe in my characters to be able to transmit life to those characters, and finally the readers will feel that those are living characters.
That's true. And I think it works. I mean, I also think this is the reason why the Jacobian building was put into a film, I think even 2 times, and it was a very successful film. And I love to see it, and I think many other people will do so too. So now we are confronted, everybody, I mean, in the Arab world, in Europe, in the US, with this very difficult situation of the coronavirus and of the pandemic. How is Egypt doing in these times? We hear a lot about the US and about Europe and maybe China, but Egypt we really don't know what's going on there.
Nobody does. The problem with the dictatorship is that you never know the reality.
Oh, yes.
You know, because it's a typical attitude by any dictatorship is to promote lies all the time. And they believe that this terrible propaganda is very essential, you know, to keep the moral of the people high. And accordingly, we don't know exactly. They said in the beginning, they said in the media, when I say the media, it's always a state media, because now the intelligence, the military intelligence and the intelligence, they are the owners of all the TV channels in Egypt. So
oh yes, oh,
yeah.
yes.
So in the beginning, they said that coronavirus will never arrive to Egypt because Egypt was mentioned in the Quran, which is totally unbelievable that people could think this way, right? Of course, it didn't work and Corona happened, right? So they said that COVID-19 is under control, and they say that the many experts from the West will come to Egypt to learn the Egyptian experience. You see,
Yes.
how the Egyptians did. Between the 2 lies, they had one big lie that we Egyptians, we have found the vaccine for Corona. You see,
Oh, oh.
they said that on TV, and they
Wow.
said that we are giving our friends in China the Egyptian vaccine. I
Oh,
mean, it's terrible. So you never know.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's hard. So, as a doctor, how do you think the coronavirus, will it disappear? Will we just learn to live with it? What is your expectation as a doctor?
No, I think we will find the solution. But when I say we, I'm referring to human beings, you know, because I don't like anybody to get infected, or even, of course, I'm against the Egyptian regime, but I would have wished if the Egyptian regime was capable to control Corona, because if he doesn't control the pandemic, it means that many Egyptians will die and will suffer. The problem is that we have discovered, and this is a lesson we should take, that there is a misuse of the money in the West. You see why? Because I lived in France, in Spain. You find in Spain, for example, Spain is a very good example. A very rich industrial country, and they didn't have enough money to buy ventilators and to buy many Spanish people, Spanish patients died because there was no enough number of ventilators. And I think this is a lesson for humanity. We human beings, I'm talking especially about the Western countries, Western governments, they are paying billions of dollars to make arms and to sell arms. So and they didn't pay enough money for the health care. So you are paying a lot of money to kill, and you don't have enough money to cure people. So I think this should be a turning point in the attitude of the Western governments.
Of course, we are in a new situation for our own lifetime. but seen from the perspective of world history, humanity was always confronted with epidemics and pandemics. We read about it in literature, we read about it in Thucydides, the old Greek historian. We read about it in Boccaccio, in the Italian Renaissance. We read about it in many other books. What do you think will be the effect? What will be the influence of the pandemic onto literature? What will change from a cultural and literary perspective, and how will it be reflected in literature? Do you think it will leave some impression on literature?
Absolutely, because usually the writer is not only inspired by the happy moments. I would say even the happy moments mostly are not very much inspiring. If you have a happy moment, you should live your happiness. I mean, there is no need for you to write. But usually we writers, we are inspired by the difficult moments of life. And I think the pandemic has been a very difficult moment in every aspect. I have had a very difficult experience. I was in France, and I was supposed to teach at the university in Marseille and in Menton, and I had a very busy schedule of book signing, in Italy, in Greece, and then I arrived and I enjoyed Marseille for 1 week, and then the pandemic, I had a total lockdown at the University of Marseille for 3 months.
Ooh.
And I found myself totally isolated with 2 or 3 professors and many cats, So I must tell you, I usually like, of course, cats and dogs, but I prefer dogs, honestly. But because of the situation, we had a kind very, very unique communication, I and the cats, because I was living by myself in the whole building with the cats. So of course they didn't understand, but they felt that the situation is very difficult, So they used to come to me, to have a kind of human, communication. So it was very difficult, So, and the first time there was a déconfinement, the lockdown was over, I went to the street in Marseille, and people were greeting each other. People were hugging each other they didn't know each other, but there was this feeling of freedom,
Yes.
So I think it's very much inspiring.
Yes, I think so. So we are looking forward to read about all these experiences later, and to compare it with our own experience, and maybe we read a story or something from your part. Would be lovely.
I work on my new novel now. I have begun, and it's about Alexandria in a turning point in 1960, in the 60s.
Wonderful.
Yes. So when this cosmopolitan city, because of the military dictatorship, people who were born in Alexandria for generations, like Italians, Greek people, Jewish Egyptians, they all of a sudden they realize that there are no more Egyptians, and they must leave. They must leave. So I'm right. This is my next novel.
I'm looking forward to that one. Yes.
Thank you, my dear.
That's an important story.
Thank
you very much, Alaa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day, dear Alaa.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.